What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense and unpredictable actors sits down with a morning show host who thinks he can play hardball and finds out, live on air, that he's picked the wrong man to corner? What began as a simple promotional interview turned into a verbal firefight when Tom Hardy faced George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America. Within minutes, the polite smiles vanished, the small talk burned away, and what was supposed to be light television became one of the most brutal on-air confrontations ever broadcast. A moment where charm collapsed, truth cut through the script, and one man walked away, leaving the other speechless. Tom Hardy sits across from George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America, and Hardy's there to promote his latest film. But George has other plans. George started with the kind of tone morning hosts are trained to use. Warm, casual, almost rehearsed. But there was something slightly off in his smile. Something too careful. Tom, before we get into your film, I'd like to talk about your comments on mental health. It was the kind of lead-in that always meant trouble. Tom Hardy didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair slightly, studying George with a look that was more clinical than emotional. His reply came slow, his voice low and steady. Irresponsible? That's a curious word to use. George. The air between them tightened instantly. There wasn't anger in Hardy's tone yet, just precision. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing like he was dissecting every syllable. Care to elaborate? Or is this one of those mornings where the cue cards do the thinking? The line hit like a punch wrapped in calmness. George forced a small laugh, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Well, several advocates, he started, but Hardy cut in before he could even finish. Several? That's always the magic number of someone who hasn't read a single source. His tone was half amusement, half warning. You could tell he wasn't angry. He was just done pretending to play along. George tried to recover, keeping his voice smooth. We just want to give context, Tom. Some critics are worried your comments might be misunderstood. Hardy leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, staring him down. You mean they're worried you might not get your segment's drama quota for the day? George took a careful breath, trying to sound composed. They're saying your methods glamorize unhealthy behavior. The line came out rehearsed, like something he'd practiced in front of a mirror, smooth on the surface but trembling underneath. Hardy's mouth twitched, forming what might have been a smile if there'd been any warmth in it. Instead, he laughed quietly, a sound that landed somewhere between disbelief and disgust. Right, he said, dragging the word out. Because pretending to care about mental health gets better ratings, doesn't it? His tone was calm, but it hit like a body shot. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Each one carried the weight of a man who'd seen this kind of game before and was ready to call it out for what it was. George blinked, thrown off. That's not what he started, but Hardy cut in, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, the faint smirk gone now. His voice turned razor sharp. Let's play your game then, George. Which advocate? Which statement? Which line? Or are we still talking in horoscope terms, vague enough to fit any narrative you like? The way he said horoscope made it sound like an insult wrapped in truth. George fumbled through his notes, eyes flicking down and back up again, buying time that Hardy wasn't willing to give him. I'm just relaying concerns. George tried again, voice thin and nervous. Hardy's head tilted slightly, his tone dropping so low it almost vibrated. No, you're not relaying concerns, he said slowly, every syllable deliberate. You're relaying gossip dressed up in concern. There's a difference, George. One demands evidence, The other demands airtime. The way he said it didn't just challenge George's words, it dismantled them. His stare stayed locked, unblinking, like he was waiting for George to prove he had anything real to stand on. George's mouth opened, but no words came out. Hardy leaned back just enough to make the silence louder. "You see, the problem with this little trick," he added, voice steady, "is that it only works on people who are afraid to call it what it is." Hardy leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, voice low and deliberate. "Let's test your preparation, George," he said, each word slow enough to sting. "Quote me, word for word, the line that has you so morally offended." He didn't blink, didn't smile. The challenge wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of someone who already knew the answer. George glanced down at his stack of notes, pretending to scan through them, but his fingers were moving too fast, more like he was searching for an exit than a page. "Well," he began, his throat tightening, "in multiple interviews." "Ah, multiple," Hardy cut in smoothly, his mouth curving into a faint mocking grin. "That's journalistic shorthand for, 'I have nothing.'" He leaned back slightly, eyes still locked on George. "You ever notice that, George? When someone says multiple sources, it usually means they can't name one." The tone wasn't playful. It was surgical. He wasn't talking to a host anymore. He was dissecting one. George let out a thin laugh, trying to keep the air light, but it cracked halfway through. "Tom, no need to get defensive," he said, forcing a smile that looked more like a wince. Hardy didn't move. "Defensive?" he repeated, his voice dropping lower. "Defensive is what people do when they're hiding something." "I'm not hiding. I'm asking." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make George squirm. "You came here with your cue cards, your second-hand quotes, your pre-written outrage. I came here with the truth. So, if you've got a line that offends you so deeply, read it out loud. Let's both see what you actually have." George tried to speak, but Hardy didn't give him room to breathe. "No? Nothing?" Hardy's tone sharpened. "Then maybe the problem isn't what I said. Maybe the problem is you needed a villain before the show even started." He leaned back again, eyes narrowing to a calm, deadly focus. "And now that the script's falling apart, you don't know how to ad-lib honesty." Hardy didn't ease up for a second. His tone was steady, but his words cut with surgical precision. "You accused me of glorifying danger," he said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed like a spotlight. "So, let's make this simple. Show me where. Show me when. Show me who said it. Go on." There was no heat in his voice, just an unnerving calm that felt far more dangerous than anger. The kind of calm that comes from a man who knows he's right and is willing to drag the truth into the open, inch by inch. George hesitated, his throat tightening. "We've reviewed several reports," he stammered, eyes darting back to his notes like they might suddenly save him. Hardy tilted his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. But it wasn't kind. It was the kind of smile people give right before they tear something apart. "Reports," he echoed, almost amused. "You mean recycled headlines written by people who've never acted a day in their lives, never studied psychology, never taken the risk of feeling something real and ugly, so audiences could see something true." He paused just long enough to make George look up, and then went in for the kill. "You call that journalism?" Hardy asked softly, voice tightening around the edges. "I call it a lazy man's echo chamber, where one shallow headline bounces off another until it sounds like fact." His gaze hardened. "You read gossip. You believed it." And now you're pretending it's research. George tried to hold his ground, but his tone cracked as he spoke. Tom, please, we're live. It came out half as a plea, half as a warning. Hardy didn't even blink. So are your false claims, he shot back instantly. The words weren't yelled. They were delivered with the quiet precision of a knife being turned. If you can say them on air, George, then I can answer them on air. That's how honesty works. For a moment, George just sat there, mouth open but silent, as Hardy stared him down. Hardy's eyes never left his face, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was low enough to make the entire exchange feel like a confession. You brought me here to talk about my film, George. Instead, you've turned this into a courtroom. So fine. Let's treat it like one. And right now, your evidence is hearsay. At best, Hardy leaned forward until his elbows rested on his knees, his voice quiet but coiled like a spring. You said I influence young actors, he began, eyes narrowing in that way that made every sentence sound like a challenge. Let's talk influence, then. His tone sharpened, every word deliberate. You sit here every morning teaching millions to mistake smugness for intellect, to think polished delivery counts as truth. You sell certainty, George, even when you have none. How's that for impact? The sentence hung in the air, calm but laced with venom. It wasn't yelling, it was precision warfare. George's jaw tightened. His hands, still on the desk, clenched until the knuckles showed white. I think we should keep this civil, he said, the words forced through a thin smile that no longer fooled anyone. Hardy let out a short breath that sounded more like a scoff than a laugh. He sat back, but his eyes didn't move. Civil? He repeated, almost amused. You ambush me with moral accusations, twist my words into headlines, then beg for civility when you're cornered? His voice stayed even, but it carried that dangerous stillness, the kind that made people stop breathing for fear of what came next. He tilted his head, just slightly, and a grin crept onto his face. Not friendly, not playful, but surgical. You don't want civility, George, he said softly. You want control. And you've just lost it. The grin faded as quick as it appeared, replaced by something colder. George's face flushed deep red. You're twisting my words, he snapped, trying to regain the upper hand, but his tone betrayed him. Defensive, brittle, unconvincing. Hardy's expression didn't change. He leaned forward again, voice dropping to a near whisper. No, George. I'm not twisting your words. His next sentence came out slow, each word spaced like a strike. I'm holding them steady, so the world can finally see what they mean. He let the silence that followed stretch long enough to sting, then added, low and final, and what they mean is this. You didn't come here to ask questions. You came to perform outrage. The difference is, I don't play along. George straightened in his chair, forcing authority back into his voice. Our research team confirmed, he began, the words rehearsed, as if the mention of a team might lend him some weight. But Hardy didn't give him the satisfaction of finishing the sentence. That I breathe oxygen and blink occasionally, he cut in, tone sharp as a blade. Because that's about the level of detail you've offered so far. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that cold precision that made the silence after its sting even more. Hardy's eyes didn't move, didn't even flicker. You've got a research team, George? He continued, the sarcasm rolling out slow and deadly. Tell me, what exactly did they confirm? That I act? That I prepare for my roles? That I care too much about my craft to play it safe? Congratulations. Groundbreaking journalism. He sat back now, crossing his arms in a way that wasn't casual. It was calculated. Every move he made felt deliberate, measured. "You came here pretending to discuss art," he said, his tone dropping lower, calmer, but somehow far more dangerous. "But all you brought were talking points and panic." His words were surgical, the kind that sliced through any pretense left. "You showed up with cue cards, headlines, and a moral lecture you didn't even write. That's not curiosity, George. That's performance." George blinked hard, the forced smile returning like a shield. "You're making this personal," he said, his voice thinner now, struggling to sound in control. Hardy tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Personal?" he repeated, almost whispering. "It became personal when you questioned my integrity on live television without a single fact to back it up." He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, voice tightening with precision. "You called me irresponsible, George. You accused me of glorifying danger. But the only dangerous thing here is your comfort with dishonesty." The pause that followed felt endless. Then Hardy exhaled slowly, the corner of his mouth curving in a humorless grin. "You turned it into theater," he said, calm again. "So let's at least make it a good one." His gaze locked in, unflinching. "I'm just improving the dialogue." The line landed like a final strike, quiet, deliberate, and humiliating. Hardy didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His control was the tension. In that moment, he wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling the entire act, piece by piece, while George sat there, trapped inside the show he thought he was running. George cleared his throat, the words barely making it out. "We need to move on," he said, low and hesitant, the kind of line that wasn't meant to convince anyone, just to survive the moment. His voice had lost that anchor of authority he always carried, replaced by something softer, smaller. He wasn't leading the interview anymore. He was trying to escape it. Hardy tilted his head slightly, studying him with that unnervingly calm stare that always seemed one thought ahead of everyone else. "Move on?" he repeated, letting the phrase stretch out just long enough to humiliate. "You set the fire, and now you want to skip the smoke." His tone was even, but the weight behind it was crushing. The power dynamic had flipped completely. George was shrinking. Hardy was towering without ever raising his voice. "You brought me here to talk about my work," Hardy continued, leaning forward now, elbows on the desk. "You decided that wasn't interesting enough, so you manufactured controversy. You threw words like irresponsible and dangerous around, and now that the heat's turned back on you, suddenly you want to move on?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's not moving on, George. That's running away." George shuffled the papers in front of him, his fingers trembling slightly, eyes darting toward the next question on the card, as if it could save him. "I'm giving you a chance to discuss your film," he said, but the words came out clipped, brittle, like he was trying to convince himself that he still controlled the conversation. Hardy didn't buy it for a second. "You had that chance at the beginning," he said, tone sharp as glass. "You traded it for 5 minutes of self-righteous airtime. You wanted your moral soundbite, your moment of authority, and now that it's unraveling, you want to pretend it never happened." George tried to interrupt, but Hardy's words rolled right over him. "You wanted to provoke a reaction," Hardy said. "Well, here it is. The reaction of someone who's done being polite to people who mistake their cue cards for conviction." His voice stayed low, calm, but it carried the force of someone who'd been holding this frustration for years. "You're the one who turned this into a debate." "I'm just making sure it's an honest one," George finally snapped, his voice trembling between anger and desperation. "You're being difficult," he said, louder this time, trying to sound in charge but failing. The mask of the calm, in-control anchor was gone. Now he sounded like a man exposed. Hardy leaned back, crossing his arms again. The pause he left before speaking was long enough to make George visibly uncomfortable. "No, George," he said quietly, his voice almost intimate but laced with steel. "I'm not being difficult. I'm being inconvenient." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing. "Difficult is when someone's trying to waste your time. Inconvenient is when someone forces you to face the truth you've been dodging." He let that hang in the air for a beat too long, then added softly, "There's a difference." The final words were quiet, but they landed with the finality of a door slamming shut. George looked down at his notes again, though it was clear he wasn't reading anymore. The control he'd started the interview with had vanished completely, and Hardy sat there, calm, steady, unflinching, the only man in the room who still looked like he belonged in front of a camera. George straightened in his chair, trying to gather the shards of authority he'd lost. His tone carried a forced steadiness, the kind that masks panic. "We have standards here at ABC," he said, emphasizing the word standards like it was supposed to restore order, like it could build a wall between him and the man sitting across from him. It was the kind of line that usually closed arguments, not opened them. But Hardy just watched him, the faintest flicker of a smile forming, not warm, not amused, but cold, deliberate, almost pitying. "Then consider this," Hardy said slowly, voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Your crash course in living up to them." The room seemed to freeze on that line. His tone was measured, surgical, but underneath it was something darker. The voice of a man who'd stopped entertaining nonsense and started teaching a lesson. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his posture relaxed, but his words razor-sharp. "You wanted accountability on air?" he asked. "Congratulations, you just found it." George swallowed hard. The line should have belonged to him. Accountability was his favorite word, his comfort zone. But now it had been taken from him, twisted, and used as a weapon. "Tom," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't sound human anymore, "please, calm down." It was the first time in the entire interview that the polished broadcaster voice cracked. Hardy tilted his head slightly, studying him like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. "I am calm," he said, his tone unshaken. "You're confusing clarity with aggression, a common mistake for people who fear truth spoken plainly." His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space completely. "You're so used to dealing with people who smile while they lie, George, that the moment someone speaks honestly, you call it hostility." George's hand tightened around his cue cards, his lips pressed together like he wanted to respond, but couldn't find the right words. Hardy didn't look away. "You say you have standards," he continued, leaning in closer. "But your version of standards seems to mean saying anything that fits inside a headline and calling it integrity. You sit behind a desk, dressed in confidence you didn't earn, and mistake politeness for professionalism." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his eyes locked on George's. "You want to talk about standards? Here's one. If you're going to accuse someone of something on live television, have the courage to back it up." His voice hardened now, every syllable deliberate. "Because what you've done here, George, isn't journalism. It's cowardice, wrapped in manners." George looked up, his composure breaking for just a second. I don't think that's fair," he muttered, but his voice was barely audible. Hardy gave a small shake of his head. Fair, he repeated, the word coming out with quiet disgust. Fair would have been asking me the questions you actually prepared for. Fair would have been telling the truth instead of performing it. But you wanted a spectacle, and now you have one. He leaned back in his chair, voice calm again, but there was a gravity in his tone that made the air feel heavier. You keep telling people you're the adult in the room, George. But the moment you're held accountable, you flinch. He paused, the smirk gone now, his expression dead serious. That's not professionalism. That's fear dressed up as authority. For the first time since the interview began, George didn't have a single word to say. Hardy didn't need to speak louder to win. He'd already dismantled him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but silence. Hardy didn't move right away. He sat there in complete silence, staring at George, the quiet somehow louder than anything else that had been said all morning. Then, when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm, the kind of tone that carries both exhaustion and certainty. You said journalists have responsibilities, he began, each word slow, deliberate, and deadly. You're absolutely right. They start with evidence, they continue with honesty, and they end with humility. He paused, his eyes never leaving George's. You've displayed none of those things. The room felt smaller now. George swallowed hard, trying to sound composed, but failing. That's unfair, he started. But Hardy cut across him before he could breathe again. No, he said sharply, the edge in his voice slicing through the air. What's unfair is inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of having a conversation, only to ambush them with gossip you can't even source. His voice grew colder, but it wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. What's unfair, he continued, leaning forward, is hiding behind your teleprompter when you're cornered, pretending you're just doing your job, when the truth is you came here looking for controversy, not truth. George's face tightened, and he shifted slightly in his chair, but Hardy wasn't finished. You want to talk about responsibility? He asked, his tone cutting clean. Let's talk about it. You have a platform that reaches millions. People trust you to ask questions that matter, and you waste it manufacturing drama. His stare deepened, unwavering. You think accountability only applies to your guests, not to you. You think this desk, this title, this network gives you immunity from the same standards you demand of others. That's your mistake, George. George's lips parted, but his voice barely came out. Tom, I think we've said enough. Maybe we should… Hardy leaned in slightly, interrupting him without raising his tone. You wanted a soundbite, George, he said softly, but his voice carried with unnerving clarity. Here it is. Accountability isn't aggression. It's the sound of truth finally getting airtime. He paused for a beat, long enough to let the sentence burn into the air. You wanted a viral moment? Congratulations. You just became one. George tried to look away, but Hardy's eyes held him there. The energy between them had shifted completely. Hardy wasn't the guest anymore. He was the one running the conversation. Slowly, he straightened up in his chair, and after a long moment of silence, he rose to his feet. The movement wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, unhurried, the gesture of someone who knew he'd already won. He adjusted his jacket, the smallest smirk pulling at his mouth. You wanted ratings, he said, his tone flat, cutting, final. You just got them. He stepped around his chair, gaze still locked on George. But not the kind you'll enjoy replaying. He held that look for a few seconds longer, long enough for it to sting, then turned and walked off camera without another word. George sat frozen, staring after him, his face pale, his hand trembling slightly over his notes. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but nothing came out. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. The kind of silence that says a line has been crossed, and nothing will go back to how it was. Hardy had left the set, but the weight of his words, evidence, honesty, humility, lingered like smoke. And sitting there under the studio lights, George looked exactly like what Hardy had just accused him of being. A man surrounded by words, but with nothing left to say. Hardy rose from his chair slowly, every movement deliberate, controlled, the exact opposite of the chaos George had tried to create. He didn't slam anything, didn't raise his voice, didn't even glance at the cameras. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and adjusted the microphone still clipped to his lapel. For a second, the only sound was the faint creak of the chair behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The interview was over, and everyone knew it, especially George. As Hardy began to walk toward the edge of the set, he paused just long enough to deliver his parting line, his tone cool and surgical. "Next time," he said, without turning around, "read the article before you quote it." The words weren't shouted, but they carried like thunder. It was the kind of line that didn't just end a conversation, it buried it. George sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, but no sound coming out. The man who'd opened the show with his trademark confidence now looked small, almost hollow. He didn't try to argue, didn't try to recover. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. Silence became his only refuge, and even that felt like a confession. Hardy kept walking, his steps measured, unhurried. He didn't look back once. There was no victory gesture, no self-congratulation, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew he'd already said everything that needed saying. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment it felt like the air itself had shifted. He left behind the unmistakable weight of truth, the kind that doesn't need volume to be heard. Hardy hadn't shouted, hadn't postured, hadn't played to the crowd. He'd simply used words like scalpel cuts, and when he was done, he left them bleeding. Not from noise, but from clarity. It was the perfect exit for a man who didn't need to win the argument to dominate it. All he needed was the truth, and the courage to speak it out loud. What just happened wasn't an interview. It was a reckoning. Tom Hardy didn't storm off in anger. He walked away in absolute control, leaving a veteran host speechless on live television. If you believe that truth still has a place on camera, hit subscribe for more real, unfiltered showdowns where words cut deeper than any script ever could. Subscribe now, drop a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and don't forget to share this story before it disappears from the headlines.